In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'll tell you why the Pelicans got a steal with the Trey Murphy extension and how it impacts Brandon Ingram and maybe even CJ McCollum. It's the Tuesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans at NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Tuesday, day after the Pelicans signed Trey Murphy to an extension. We're going to break that down because there might be some sticker shock with it, but I'm going to tell you why it's actually a steal of a contract for New Orleans. This is a great deal. I'll explain why in today's show. We're then going to look at the impact on Brandon Ingram, CJ McCollum, the rest of the roster for next year, because that's what this impacts. Then we're going to get into some transaction news and some spicy fan takes that I'm going to rate, and we'll do this in tomorrow's show as well. So, of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, coming to you every single day. So subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans listeners on YouTube as well, Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. I got something new for you. This is exciting. These actually launched yesterday. Your favorite podcast now has a newsletter. Introducing Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter, one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That's lockedondaily.com and start your day with the all-new free Locked On Pelicans newsletter. These are really cool. You'll get something from me every single day. There's stuff about the league. There's fantasy basketball, links to other Pelicans coverage. It's launching this week. It's pretty fun. So please subscribe. It's going to be awesome. LockedOnDaily.com. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. So let's get into the Trey Murphy extension. Though quickly, you see the background. I told you I'm traveling all this week, driving from the West Coast back to New Orleans. Bear with me if the sound's a little bit off, but I think it's pretty good here. The different backdrops, and we'll be back to usual. Usually, I think on Friday, hopefully, and definitely next week, but we've got all the coverage you need here. So let's start with the Trey Murphy extension. This is a steal for the New Orleans Pelicans. 4 years, $112 million total here. That comes to about $28 million per year. And there's going to be some sticker shock with this. This is for someone who hasn't started like regularly in his career, and he's now making almost $30 million. That seems like a lot. But one thing we need you to look at here when you start looking at these sorts of deals that are going to get thrown around is the salary cap is rising with new TV money coming in. And this is going to lead to some sticker shock. So rather than looking at the raw numbers, you want to start looking at percent of the salary cap. What percent of the salary cap is a player taking up? If he's getting these 8% standard raises, his deal should start at $25 million next year. That's a little over 16%, 16.17% of the estimated salary cap next season. The salary cap is also going to be going up 10% every single year. Standard NBA contracts have an 8% raise in it every year. So in a sense, the Trey Murphy deal isn't going to be beating inflation. It's beating it in like the real sense of the real world, but it's not beating it in the sense of the salary cap. So that 16.17% shrinks each year of the 4 years here. So basically what this means about each season with this deal, the Pelicans are saving or gaining an additional 2% of the salary cap. That might not sound like a lot, but 2% is going to make or break this team a little bit, and we'll particularly look at the total numbers of everything in the next segment here. But you need to start thinking about percent of the salary cap and what a player is taking up when it comes to that, because some of these numbers are going to sound silly. You're going to be seeing guys making $70 million per year, but if that's only 20%, 25, 30% of the salary cap, that's an okay number, and it's not just one of those numbers where it's like, wait, what? That guy's making how much money? $28 million per year, slightly over 16% of the salary cap for Trey Murphy is exactly what you want. I said I thought he'd get about 5 years, 140, somewhere between 135 and 145. So the middle there is 140. 5 years, 140 is exactly the same as the 4 years, 112. So this is exactly what I thought he would be making. More to come on the years here in a second. So let me be clear again. At 16% of the salary cap, $28 million on average per year, this is a great deal for the Pelicans. Trey is an assumed starter with this team, at least in the future, if not this season. More on that actually in the third segment. He works insanely well next to Zion Williamson. This is the guy that Zion Williamson had the single best net rating with. When you look at Zion and one other player, the best net rating, which is the number that I like to look at to evaluate effectiveness, has the highest of with Zion and anyone else who played significant minutes. This is a really good deal for someone who would have gotten near max money on the open market. He fits on literally every team. As a long guy who takes threes, makes threes, does deep threes, can dunk as well, has the tools to be a good defender, even if he's not a good defender right now. He can be a good rebounder. We saw that improve this last season. And when I talked to him one-on-one at Media Day, he said that, rebounding is just about going and getting the ball, and he's going to do more of that this year when he's healthy. So I don't know. In my opinion, this is just good. This is a guy they had to lock down. This is a presumed starter in the future, a guy that shoots threes at a very high rate, and those deep threes that he takes too are really important to this team. If you're a threat to shoot well beyond the three-point line, sometimes near the logo at half court, teams need to account for that. If you make those at a high rate, and Trey does, teams need to account for that. They'll put a guy on you up there. That means more space for Zion Williamson. Threes space the court. Deep threes, if you hit them well, that spaces the court even more. Trey Murphy does all of that. If he puts everything else together, this is someone who has improved every single year, I think, and is going to be really, really good for this team. Now, it's not a perfect deal for the New Orleans Pelicans. It's a steal, don't get me wrong, but it is not a perfect deal for the New Orleans Pelicans here. It's 4 years instead of 5. To get this deal done, sacrificing a year on it is definitely a concession made by the Pelicans and probably one they had to make. 5 years with no player options would have been great, but Trey likely would have wanted max money then. 4 years with no player options locks in generational money for him. So congrats to Trey Murphy for this. It's a good deal for the Pelicans. Everyone would take this guy at this amount of money on their team. All 29 other teams would do it. And then Trey hits free agency a year early for his next contract, so he'll get paid likely, we would imagine, on that one too. So I do think this deal gives the Pelicans 3 of the best contracts in the league. They locked in Herb Jones last year on a deal that is just frankly a steal, even more so than this one, I think. They locked in Jose earlier this offseason, and now Trey Murphy here. And this locks Trey in as a member of the Pelicans core alongside Zion Williamson and Herb Jones, and a little bit smaller of part of the core, DeJounte Murray. So overall, this is a great thing for the New Orleans Pelicans. I'm thrilled about this deal. I think they're thrilled about this deal. Everyone's happy here. That's what we want to see. Now we just got to get Trey healthy. He's not going to be ready on opening night on Wednesday, but he's going to be back probably around the beginning of November, we hope. He's going to be reevaluated sometime this week, I would imagine. So it does impact other players, particularly Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum. And we're going to get into the salary cap, the numbers about why that is. Let's look at what happens with them coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by America's #1 sportsbook, FanDuel. NBA fans, you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You can do it right now. Pelicans opening night line, it's tomorrow. -7.5 of the Chicago Bulls. I feel really good about that one. Do you feel good about their win total? The over-under there. What about Zion for MVP? Trey to win most improved player. You can do all of that over at FanDuel. And if you put down a $5 bet right now, you're going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. And you can do that over at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second, not even your second listen. Here's what I need you to do next. Go to LockedOnDaily.com and sign up for the Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter. Again, ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox every single day, completely free over at LockedOnDaily.com. You're going to get something from me, something from around the league, fantasy, links to other Pelican stories that you might want to read as well. It's a really great option for you. Please sign up for it at LockedOnDaily.com. So Trey Murphy signed his extension. He's going to be making $28 million next year. That is important to note here, that this does not impact anything this year in terms of the salary cap. It does impact moves the Pelicans will make, knowing that you've got his money, his extension kicking in next season, but it doesn't change the money for the team this year. They're still slightly in the luxury tax. They're likely to deduct the luxury tax. It didn't put them more in the luxury tax or anything like that. It impacts them next season. And what that means is it's going to impact CJ McCollum and or Brandon Ingram in some capacity. To put this simply, the Pelicans can't keep everyone. Zion Williamson is locked in. So is Herb. So is Trey. DeJounte Murray is presumably a core guy as well. So let's look at some of the percent of the salary cap for guys on the team next season. And some of these are estimates here. But right now, the Pelicans have Zion Williamson taking up 25% of the salary cap. Murray and CJ McCollum are each at 20%. Trey is 16% and Herb Jones is 9%. If you add all of that up, if I'm good at my math and I was an English major, so maybe not here, I believe that's 90% before anyone else. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys taking up 90% of your salary cap. You have a roster of 14 to 15. You can kind of see where this is going here. And that's before we factor in Brandon Ingram and whatever extension he could get for the team or what his next contract would look like. That's not going to work. So what this means is that either CJ McCollum or Brandon Ingram, and maybe both, won't be on the roster next season. I'm not saying Brandon Ingram is definitely gone because I don't necessarily think that. It's more likely than not. And I definitely think this is a step in that direction. But it doesn't mean that he's for sure gone. It could be CJ McCollum. CJ McCollum next year makes $30.6 million. Ingram wants a max deal, which would put him at an average annual value of $42 million. More than that $42 million in a second here. The cap sheet is tight next year. And even if Brandon Ingram comes down from that max number, anything that's more than what CJ is making next season, which is less than what Ingram makes now, makes this really tough to work with. It's doable, but tough. I also think it could make it tough to trade Brandon Ingram this season, as you need to take back salary. At this point, the Pelicans would need to almost take back expiring contracts unless you package Ingram with others. Trying to find a long-term center that fits on this team long-term, right? Say you trade Brandon Ingram for Jared Allen. Where do you fit Jared Allen's $20 million next season onto this team? I don't see how that would fully work as they're constructed right now. So it's not just, that it kind of forces Brandon Ingram out, and I don't know if it necessarily does, but it might force Ingram and CJ McCollum out here. Not saying it's a guaranteed thing here, but if the Pelicans look to move Ingram for just expiring deals, even though he's an expiring deal, maybe you keep one of those guys, maybe you don't. Maybe you can get 2 pieces that at least help you this year, but don't feel like long-term pieces. Salary dumping Ingram, which is essentially what that's doing, doesn't seem too appealing to me. It's just tough to be this top heavy. We saw a trend from the league for a while where guys, it was triples in the league, right? You saw the Heatles, the Miami Heat of LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh. You saw trios like that around the league. And as some of the times the salary cap has gotten a little bit more punitive over the years, particularly this season with that dreaded second apron, and even kind of scary first apron too. You've seen the league move from trios to duos over the past couple of years. Not always like that, but it's really tough to kind of be in that spot where you have multiple guys. At this point, it would essentially be, if you signed Ingram to an extension, 4 guys making over 20% of the salary cap, with a guy making 16%, with Herb, let's round him up and call it 10%. That gets really, really tough for what this team is looking to do here. And I just don't see how the money works out. And this is something that's important. Look, I want them to go deep into the luxury tax every year and pay it. They should. It's not my money. I don't care. But that's not the reality of the situation here. With this Trey Murphy extension kicking in next year, and I can pull up, what some of these guys are making, it's a lot that you're paying. I just don't see a way this really works for New Orleans. Maybe they realize they can sign Ingram to an extension and then you trade CJ McCollum. Or maybe they just go, we're going to keep Ingram on the roster this whole season and then try and re-sign him this offseason and then trade CJ McCollum in some sort of salary dump maneuver. It's going to be tougher to do that next offseason when no team has salary cap space. The Houston Rockets just used a ton of theirs, signing Alperen Şengün to a pretty big deal, even though that's good value for him. This basically might mean that the Pelicans keep Ingram and let him walk after this season. This was always going to be a potential possibility when it comes to it. I do think Ingram is more valuable here than anywhere else around the league. But if the money doesn't work, the money doesn't work. And maybe the Pelicans try and duck the luxury tax this year and go into it next year paying it. But I believe even right now before an extension, they're kind of already pushing that like first, second apron when it comes to it, because this team is going to have a lot of money on the books next year with just those 4 guys. Zion making almost $40 million. Murray making 31.5, CJ at 30.6, Trey Murphy at 25, Herb at 14 million. I mean, these numbers are truly, in my opinion, like a great, great thing. These guys look really good, and I'm excited about them. But that puts them, let me see if I can see where the second apron is when it comes to that before you even sign other players. That's on the roster next season, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, just 10 guys. You got to sign 5 more guys, and you'd put a 25% cap hit, let's say, on Brandon Ingram, which is around $38 or so million next year. They're going to be pushing that luxury tax threshold like already. And that's not going to be, they're going to be over that first apron when they sign him. They're going to be pushing that second apron, and I don't know if that's really what they're going to do. So unless Brandon Ingram takes a well below market deal, and maybe he's forced to, maybe not, I couldn't tell you, it really does feel like it's somewhat squeezing him out. That is risky. I love Trey as a player. I think he's a core guy. I think his usage rate being less than Brandon Ingram's makes him fit particularly well on this team, but he's not as good of a passer. I do think Ingram's a better defender than Trey Murphy is. I think Murphy's the better overall fit for this team, but Ingram's really talented, and as a passer, he's dramatically underrated in my opinion. What's that do for you? How do you kind of make this all work? If Trey's your future starter, but maybe Ingram's the better player right now, do you still just need to start Trey? Do you move Ingram to the bench? These are all kind of open and valid questions right now, and we don't have the answer to those. And as much as you'd like to have that for the start of the regular season, you're not going to get that with the Pelicans. But this basically means one of CJ or Ingram is not going to be here next year. Maybe both. More likely Ingram out of the two. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube here. Let me know what you think of the Trey extension. If you had to pick one to kind of get rid of from the team, just kind of say salary dump them. Is it CJ McCollum? Is it Brandon Ingram? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. But there's definitely an impact on these two players. As much as I, love this deal for Trey Murphy, there's a knock-on effect when it comes to all of that here. So there's some other transaction news that I want to get to for the Pelicans in the next segment here. I also want to get into a couple of real spicy takes. I rated them on a scale of 1 to 5 here. I'll read those off to y'all and let you know what I think of them. These are going to be kind of fun. We'll do some of these tomorrow as well. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Halloween lets us have fun with what scares us, but what about those fears that don't involve zombies and ghosts? Therapy is a great tool for facing your fears and finding ways to overcome them. Because sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place and holding ourselves back. I just had a situation with this where I just needed to handle some stuff. I really wasn't looking forward to doing it, and I kept putting it off. It was literally like keeping me up at night. And then one day I just decided to like face those fears, do it. And I felt so much better, slept better, all of that when it comes to that. Those are skills that I've learned from therapy. I've used BetterHelp myself in the past. I don't have time to go to a doctor's office, sit down, do all that. What I love about BetterHelp is it's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. So you fill out a questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, you can switch at no additional charge, and you just have your session and you work on what you need to work on. Therapy is not just for people who've experienced major trauma. This is something that can help you set boundaries, learn how to face your fears, basically empower you to be the best version of yourself. So overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA to get started. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team, now with a newsletter. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast for a reason. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints. We didn't have to sit through a Saints game on Sunday. That felt good. But there's still stuff to play for. Maybe a top pick, maybe not. Are they going to be too good to get a top 5 pick in the upcoming NFL draft? Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast, is going to break that all down for y'all over at Locked On Saints. Everything you need for black and gold. So go make him your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So a couple quick transaction notes here when it comes to the New Orleans Pelicans on kind of the final day as they're setting their rosters. Teams around the league were doing all of this. The Pelicans announced they waived Malcolm Hill, who was on a 2-way deal, and then they signed Brandon Boston Jr. off of waivers, and he is going to be on a 2-way deal. He's a shooting guard wing player, about 6'7", who's been with the Clippers for the past 3 years. Some flashes, averages 6.2 points per game for his career, 31.3% shooter from 3, but he is very athletic, played at Kentucky, so there's a good pedigree there. This was someone I liked actually coming into the league. He hasn't really kind of staked out his spot, but it's a 2-way, just some depth on the wing for someone they want to try out. What's kind of interesting is back in the 2021 draft, he was actually involved in the Trey Murphy, Jonas Valanciunas trade when he was drafted. So he was involved in that and now comes back to New Orleans on a 2-way deal. But what I want to do in this segment, and I asked on Twitter when I was in a long car ride yesterday, and I'm going to be on a long car ride tomorrow and the day after that, I want your spiciest predictions. What is your flaming hot Pelicans predictions this year? We're going to read some more of these now, or we're going to read some of these now, and we'll read some more of them tomorrow. These were pretty fun. Some of y'all have some spicy takes. Some of them are just mild. Not that much heat to them. We're going to start with one that's a little bit milder here. This comes from friend of the show, Joel Vanile, at Joel Vanile here, and he says, his spicy take: Trey replaces CJ in the starting lineup 10 games into his return from injury. So not 10 games from the start of the regular season, from when Trey comes back healthy and plays. 10 games from there, you'll see Trey Murphy in the starting lineup for the New Orleans Pelicans. Joel Vanile, I'm going to tell you, this is a 2 out of 5. This isn't that hot of a take, I don't think. This is something we've all wanted to see. This is something we've kind of predicted too. And what we were expecting maybe that CJ McCollum would be coming off of the bench. The injury to Trey kind of put him back in there. Depending on what they do with the center spot, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, that could impact it as well. So with that here, I think it's not that spicy. The reason I don't make it a 1 is, look, it's Willie Green. You never know what that's going to be here. And he might just decide to go with, the usual guys, a guy that he trusts in CJ McCollum. CJ, to his credit, said he would come off the bench. He wasn't going to volunteer to do it, but he wants to do whatever's best for the team. And if he's coming off the bench, he's just going to tell you, I'm paid like a starter. That's all that matters to me. Whenever he's been asked about what's it feel like to not make an all-star team, or does that bother you? He goes, well, I'm paid like an all-star, so that's good enough for me. He's definitely paid like a starter, but we do think he could come off of the bench when it comes to that. Next one that I want to get into here, And this one is, I have this one rated as a 4.5 out of 5 on the spicy rating. This one comes from at Mr. Jacob Shepard, Sheppard. Pels lose 8 of their first 10 and finish bottom 5 of the West. Like I said, 4 out of 5 on the spicy scale here because I don't think they're a conference finalist. I don't think this team's a true title contender as they're made up right now. But there's a lot of talent here. And yes, they don't have a starting center, and that's not great. But or like a starting level caliber guy. You know what I'm saying? Someone who's not basically whoever starts with them is going to be the worst starting center in the league, whoever that is. I don't know how much it'll hold him back. I'm less, in terms of rebounding, I'm middle of the road worried about it, not overly. The early returns that we saw last year with Zion at the 5, Herb at the 5, whatever you want to call it, looked pretty good, to be perfectly honest with y'all. That, like, they won their minutes by a lot, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. Win your minutes. That's going to be a theme on Locked On Pelicans this season. So overall, I do think they've done a good job with those lineups. Preseason was a little bit weird. I would have liked to have seen that small ball lineup, potential starting lineup, get some run. But I do think there's enough talent here that they're going to win games. Will it be 49-50 like it was last year? Maybe, maybe not. But unless there's an injury, I have a tough time seeing how they would finish bottom 5 in the West. I don't think the lack of a starting caliber. I don't think Jonas Valanciunas was the difference between finishing with 49 wins and then finishing bottom 5 in the Western Conference. Bottom 5 in the Western Conference, by the way, is probably like a play-in tournament team for the record when it comes to it. The Western Conference is competitive. So bottom 5 isn't one of those things where it's like a huge knock on the team. That's just how it might go a little bit. Bottom 5 in the West. Let me see what that was last year. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was the Houston Rockets of 41-41. I don't think Jonas Valanciunas is the difference between 8 wins here with this team. The Golden State Warriors, who finished 6th in the Western Conference, made the play-in tournament, had 46 wins, right? Like bottom 5 here is still good, but that's not what you're trying to say when it comes to that sort of thing. It was just basically missing the playoffs, missing the play-in tournament. I don't think that that's what's going to happen when it comes to them this year. Final one, and I like this one because this one is pretty spicy too. This is at Willsway93. And 2 starters, DeJounte Murray and Zion Williamson, will make All-NBA barring injuries to either of those players. 5 out of 5 because they're not getting 2 guys on All-NBA. So Zion could. He earned some votes last year. I had All-NBA voters, as I talked about in yesterday's show, calling me, talking to me, wanting to know a little bit more about Zion, his impact this year, and if he was a big reason for the success, and should they vote him 3rd for All-NBA. And I think that's probably where he would end up as his ceiling. So he can do it. I don't see 2 players getting on there, though. DeJounte Murray is a one-time All-Star. That's not really going to put you in the running for All-NBA. He thinks point guard is his natural position, which is what he's going to be playing. But I think it's one of those things with some of the point guards that you have in the league, it's going to be tough for him to get on there. I don't see him as a 10 assist kind of guy this season, not with Zion Williamson handling the ball, not with CJ, not with Brandon Ingram as well handling the ball. And with those guys, he knows he's not going to be the primary scorer. He's not going to be someone scoring 20 points per game. So that's 20 points per game, whatever. You know what I'm saying? So I don't see that being the case for him. I think, the assists will be nice. The defense will definitely be there. And I think he can be in the running for one of the all defensive teams. I do not see it all NBA. If that's the case, Will's Way 93, and you get both, and they get both of them. We'll give you a shout out here on the show when it comes to that. So on Twitter, at NolaJake, give me your spiciest take. There's a couple other ones. We're going to read more of them in tomorrow. Tomorrow's show, I want to look at the starting lineup. We don't know what that's going to be on opening night. We're going to have kind of the preview for all of that. That's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to have an issue with the starting lineup if they use different starting lineups, like based on the matchup. And I'll explain what I mean with that in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans, because to me, that's going to be a really big thing. I hate that idea. And if that's the case, yeah, maybe we're going to see them bottom 5 in the West, and I'll explain why that is in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Season starts tonight. We got opening night. It's going to be a lot of fun. I will be watching maybe from a car, but wherever I am, it's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure you're subscribed to Locked On Pelicans. Please go check out the newsletter at lockedondaily.com. You'll be getting that tomorrow if you sign up for it, so I hope you do. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. This has been the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I'll see you all tomorrow to get you set for Pelicans opening night.